Doug's story time continued. Days before collapse. Winter. In the last few months, storms had really gotten bad and the anarchy had got worse. It had been bad for years, but it was all finally coming together. The people that identify with Guy Fawkes and wear masks in his image had splintered up into two groups. Those who considered speech violence and those who believed in full transparency without exception. Storms had been smashing the East Coast one after another with barely a day's break between them. Some of them powerful enough to do 2 full rotations before dissipating. Where before they would hit the coast in random orders, they were now hitting the coast in nearly identical patterns in sets of 3 to 5. Infrastructure would be devastated and busted down to raw material, only to get hit a second time, scattering it everywhere. By the third time, the area was unrecognizable as a modern human settlement, and by the 5th event, it was a challenge to tell that people ever lived there. Anarchy and storms were starting to go hand in hand, with violence and looting filling the void of law and infrastructure. What began as reparations, with the theft of shoes and televisions, soon escalated into a contest to destroy what was left of whichever storm ravaged town before anyone could return to fix it. The biggest natural disaster recovery team in the country was embezzling over 90% of the aid it was receiving. Private groups were barred from nearly all assistance on the mainland except to rescue animals with the Humane Society. The checkpoints were all single direction, and people weren't allowed to return to their plot of land for a month or longer. Food and fuel became increasingly more rare and expensive. If looters were caught by law enforcement, they got a minimum 10-year sentence. If homeowners caught them first, the looters became additional casualties in the storm. When National Guard was deployed, it wasn't in any security capacity, and participation quickly dwindled as people melted back into society to protect their immediate families. The displacements became more disruptive, and the miscommunication continued to get worse. The aid organizations themselves often had false or unactionable intel. The local residents were marred by outside influences spreading false information and data. Meanwhile, some communities were fine while others ceased to exist. Floods went for 1,000 miles up and down the coast, sparing some communities and turning others into new permanent tributaries. Where there had once been a path towards salvaging situation and rebuilding, the attempted recovery effort wouldn't stop tripping over its own feet. People had been surviving a long time before gigantic corporate-sized recovery operations. Eventually, people got tired of being turned away to help. They got tired of filling up local food banks only to have the product never arrive to the affected areas. People helped directly where they could, and then responsibility ended up on every unique subdivision that had any infrastructure left. As things got worse, there was no way to jail anyone anymore, let alone feed them. What were you going to do? Put looters in general population with displaced communities? They would tear the looters apart anyway. The looters were shot. The survivors were shot again. The sheriffs in every town declared open hostility on anyone coming in that had ill intent. It was a new kind of martial law, not the kind that everyone wanted, but the kind that the towns needed. Eventually, the Humane Society struck a deal with FEMA camps and Red Cross and let everyone keep their animals. The only stipulations were the critters had to be peaceful and quarantined briefly to ensure no communicable diseases. The West Coast was due for its own big natural disaster. Everyone thought it was going to be earthquakes, and there had been several big ones. Our neighbors to the south had gotten creamed by several in a row that left thousands without power and hundreds dead. The Pacific Northwest, though? Well, they only ever got tiny blips here and there. The West Coast wasn't going to get the dreaded earthquake to end all earthquakes. It was going to get some kind of giant storm, exactly like the East Coast was getting. It was going to be in the winter, and it was going to be cold. Chapter 14, Doug Prep. Night before collapse. Pre-dawn. Day 1. Wider Portlandia area. Doug was ready to go. It didn't take much. A proprietary alarm that he rarely heard from went off out of nowhere in the middle of the night. The powers that be requested a CERT team, or a special emergency response team, to head somewhere extremely cold. No details except that we'd get him on the way. He had to be to a helicopter in town within 20 minutes, or his contract with the company would expire. The storm was going crazy where he was at. It was pounding the coast as rain, but mid-higher elevations as snow. Then it was dying out before it could accumulate on the mountains. It was a double-edged sword. There wouldn't be a huge drowning thaw in the spring, but everything prior to the mountains would be up higher than the cars in the snow for the good portion of a month. It was some kind of sleet rain mess right now that was clearing back up in the daytime and then coming back at night. The weird temperature shifts between night and day tended to have that effect. Thankfully, the messy mixture was still low enough to where Doug could get in his four-wheel drive and get on top of the frosty mixture and get to the rendezvous point. Destination was a parking garage where his vehicle would be safe and where the helicopter could land in the storm. He was almost ready when he got a big wet nose in the face. Challenger wanted to go play out in the snow. Doug understood. This dog was basically genetically designed to be out in cruddy weather. Doug had only within the last few days got Challenger back from training. He'd had his dog sent off to get a battery of rapid training courses for search and rescue as well as home defense and a couple of basic commands. It was a rush version of the training, and Challenger needed more time to be officially certified. The training was close enough to deploy as long as nobody looked too deep into the training's completion and validation. Doug hadn't even had a chance to do a full practice run at the park with Challenger. Wouldn't you know it, that some guy ran off with some gal's purse, and without 2 tourniquets would have lost more than his arm. The now armless guy wanted to press charges, but was so incoherent that the statement was mostly gibberish. Something about a dog coming out of nowhere and returning the person arm. The officer and his canine returned the arm with no suspects and no way to tell specific teeth marks from anything else. 2 otherwise unremarkable tourniquets, expertly applied on the stump by an apparent good Samaritan with dates and all, no cameras around quality enough to give a good identifier. The officer that responded was a canine officer, and so Challenger wouldn't stop flirting with the canine dog, so it ended up being okay. It got left out of the reports that it took multiple commands to get Challenger to release the mangled arm, and thankfully no videos surfaced, and the lady was happy to get her purse back, sans an extra arm. In haste, Doug forgot to pack the new command list for Challenger. Doug did, however, remember to get Challenger's tactical suit on. It was a vest with all sorts of pouches, including sleeves for canine-designed armor, plating, food, and collapsible water dish and various medicines. Challenger had acquired several wounds on him from exposure to the heat and elements, but had otherwise been okay after the forest rescue. As a result, he was fully healed up now. The medicines and first aid for his 4-legged buddy were just in case. Challenger had a new collar. It was pretty cool. Basically, it let off a little vibration that Challenger could feel if he got too far away from Doug. Doug had the matching wristband that went with it. The wristband also had a little arrow that pointed to where Challenger was at any given time. Doug pressed a button to make sure it was working, and it was. Doug always had a 3-day pack ready, but this was an extra scenario, so he threw his winter system on the bed to make sure it went with. It was a 3-part system with a goose-down inner bag that could handle about to negative 20 degrees as the primary bag, then an outer removable bag that could handle down to negative 40 as the middle layer, and lastly a 3rd bag outside, which was waterproof, stab-resistant, slash-resistant, and could breathe, usually to protect against sharp twigs and rocks. To top all that off, Doug had his cushy, insulated sleeping pad that inflated itself and his low-profile all-weather tent that was big enough for him and his bag. It was a new tent that he purchased special that had a spot for his new doggy. Rolled up with his sleeping pad was a special dog-sized sleeping pad so that Challenger didn't have to sleep on the cold ground. It wasn't good for her doggy bones, and helped to keep her warm. Even though she was a snow-type dog, they never really laid on the snow in the wild. They actually dug burrows to keep themselves warm, generally speaking, so basically these type of dogs needed help to keep in tip-top shape in sub-20 temperatures. Doug didn't think it'd be past negative 20, but it never hurt to prepare. Unfortunately, once you got past negative 20 in any sort of altitude and wind, everything changed. Fuel becomes a problem, starting fires becomes a challenge, and keeping your drinking water from freezing. It all turns into a royal pain in the butt. Wind chill starts to make the air feel exponentially colder the colder it gets and everything. There was nothing easy or safe about it. Doug thought about everything else to make sure he had everything. His watch told him he had to leave within a few minutes to get to the parking garage in time. He had 2 pairs of thermal inner layers that would keep him warm and dry and whisk sweat away. He had a middle layer to keep him warm and an outer layer that could break wind, and another layer on top of that for heavy downpours. He somehow got it all either crammed in his giant pack or rolled up on top of his pack, or he was wearing it on him. He had special boots for snow as well. They had an outer shell and an inner liner with cuffs at the top to keep feet dry. They could breathe and wouldn't get destroyed in sub-negative 40 either. With all of his main mission-specific items packed and all of his miscellaneous items already ready, He notified his pooch that he was coming as well as they headed out. To Challenger, this was absolutely no big deal, like it was something she was born for. Doug locked up and left the porch light on, and in the four-wheel drive they went.